All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you can see my screen and that everything is in order. Um, Thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor. And let's dive right into what this is supposed to be all about. Now, we've already briefly talked about who I am and what I do. I work at ThoughtWorks Germany, and most of the time I'm dealing with infrastructure and DevOps as a methodology of philosophy with our clients. There are a lot of customers in Germany that need help in that regard, but I think that's probably the same all across the world. So what is this talk going to be about? So first of all, I'd like to start off with defining what dashboards are to each and every one of us and why they have become so popular, right? Um, and why you should probably be using them and what you should be using them for. And then I'm going to move forward with what we're actually using them for today and why you or your company should probably seriously consider turning your dashboards into something else entirely if you're feeling like I've been presenting the essence of your daily dashboard routine during this talk. So if anything of this sounds familiar to you, it'll hopefully help you to argue your case. Um, Dashboards have largely been invented because information about systems, and that means any system really, not just computers, doesn't really come easily to us as humans. We only have so many senses, and we're only using about 2 to 3 of them at the same time. And most of the time with a strong focus on sight, hearing, and our balance, followed by touch and our smell. The last one is taste, in case you were wondering. But let's not count any of the spidey senses as well, like your 6 or 7 sense. But as we'll see in a few moments, discovering relevant information about a system or connecting it with already existing experiences is a tough challenge. And dashboards are meant to ease this burden for us by presenting, at least ideally, some of the key indicators that let us complete our tasks and routines more easily and more effectively. Dashboards inherently are so-called information radiators, places where you can find more context about a specific topic or even a broader set of performance values or indicators. And they make otherwise opaque information more accessible. Information you'd otherwise have to dig deeper for or look up or connect with others, or worse, wouldn't even have available in the first place. And in the context of defining an ideal dashboard, we are already striking the outskirts of what people call information theory. Because what you can apply to what scientists say about good information also applies to dashboards. They should be simple in design, easy to understand, and as unambiguous as possible, just to ensure that you won't need a lot of prior knowledge or experience to derive meaning from the display. And ideally, they should support whoever is looking at them with meaningful insights and empower them to finish their tasks faster with more added value than before. You should get something out of looking at a dashboard. Also, dashboards, like any other item of aggregated information, have an audience. So one of the most essential learnings in media and information management is usually know thy audience. So you should know about who your audience actually is. And catering to a specific set of people not only makes it easier for you to tailor your content and therefore your information, it also makes it easier for you to make people understand what you're trying to tell them in the first place. And let's let them take away, in the end, more value from the content you're presenting. And this fits the purpose of a specific dashboard, I think, rather fittingly. Last but not least, this all leads into the accessibility of dashboards. What is a dashboard with valuable information worth if the dashboard and its information is not understandable, if it's unrelatable, or not important enough for the people to notice? And this is especially relevant for how information is displayed, how its connections are visualized, how much of an intellectual burden it puts on you, the consumer, and what kind of pre-existing knowledge is necessary to really comprehend what's going on a dashboard. In short, what applies to information in and of itself also applies to dashboards. They shouldn't be a burden to keep up with, and both information and dashboards are supposed to add value and are supposed to be a pleasure to absorb. We have several categories of dashboards today. Obviously, there are a lot more you could talk about today, but for the sake of time and brevity, obviously, we only have so much time here. Here are just a few of the examples. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Can you please make the slides accessible to slides Q&A link accessible to everyone? It should be
Oh,
in your
sure, absolutely. Yes, of
yeah.
course. It defaults to only ThoughtWorkers. Absolutely.
Yes, yes.
Now be accessible to anyone.
Yeah.
Sorry for that.
Thank you.
So let's start again with the examples that you see here on the screen. So the first one is what people usually call a management dashboard. It's a typical management dashboard as that it's stuffed with relevant numbers for any day to keep the people that decide how to spend the company's value, which is money and time, informed and on the same page. And these can be used independently or within meetings, but usually they're one of the means people have to quickly catch up with what's going on in the morning or after lunch. And my screen just went out. I hope you can still see my
Yep.
presentation.
Yep. We can see your screen.
Okay, good. Then I'll just continue because for me it's not relevant to actually look at the slides. Um, and but usually they're one of the means that people have to quickly catch up with what's going on in the morning or after lunch. In all of these situations, basically get all the information in one single gist. The second part on the right-hand side, those are KPI dashboards. So typically they're presented in a department or team-wide meetings, and they have a certain audience, and they also have a certain cadence. So they only are presented every once in a while. They're otherwise used rather infrequently. So sometimes even just created or maintained manually for the one specific occasion. They're used to keep everyone's attention focused on a certain subject. So how about a theme like let's reach 1,000 subscribers or let's get 1,000 likes? These are specific topics and you build a dashboard around it. The third category on the left-hand side is what you would call a service announcement dashboard. I'm being told that the NH48 is a pretty busy highway or the busiest highway in India. So this kind of hopefully relates to what I'm trying to say here. But these are usually helpful bystanders whenever you're stuck in traffic and you're wondering how long, for example, your ride's going to take this morning or how long the queue at a specific airport is. And they're focused on one specific metric that they're displaying. And that usually depends on your location. So, for example, at the airport or on a highway, or one specific intention, like I need to get to work or I need to reach my flight, or one specific environment, like you're on the highway or you're in the city, or even one specific condition, like you're stuck in traffic or you're waiting in the queue at the security checkpoint. Um, so this is basically what a service announcement dashboard looks like. And last but not least, on the right-hand side, we're coming to engineering dashboards. And this is also what this talk is all about. And specifically about dashboards that you see and possibly interact with on a daily basis, usually even publicly displayed on a TV or monitor screen with your team or within your department. And I've also seen dashboards in hallways and busy staircases. There are lots of variety in the space, which is also why I'm giving this talk after all, because sometimes it's just a little bit too much variety, I think. Um, we're all living in an environment which is filled with a plethora of distractions. So there are urges, there are grabs for attention, there's marketing, there are ads. But one particular effect that keeps us from processing this information, and this applies especially for engineering dashboards, and scientists refer to this as what's called information overload. Everyone who's on social media today probably knows what I'm talking about, right? You have about 500 friends on Facebook and you follow 400 people on Twitter and maybe you have a couple of dozen on Instagram, and all of them have something to say or do or present and consume 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. If you as an individual would keep up with everything that's been going on, right? It would keep you busy until the day you die. And any exchanges on these platforms and the information that's contained, you wouldn't really have consumed them at all. They would have just skirted the outsides of your perception. Information overload is defined as a difficulty in understanding an issue and effectively making decisions when one has to. With as much information, with too much information about this specific issue. And we're talking about an information load with characteristics such as an amount, a complexity, or a level of redundancy, contradiction, and inconsistency that's too high to effectively make an informed decision, because the cognitive load for reaching said decision is an order of a magnitude higher than the respective processing entity, which in this case is you. you're just not able, you're just not capable, you're not designed as a human being to process so much information that's not tailored to your specific need. So in short, we as humans are absolutely overwhelmed by information on a daily basis. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what this actually means and what is happening, right? Information theory as itself is an interesting field because it describes the foundation of what we take for granted in our daily lives, the way we derive meaning from the world around us. So how are you processing information on a daily basis? And this can be everything, right? From opening your eyes in the morning and realizing it's still dark, no light is hitting the sensory receptors of your eyeballs. Realizing this is probably due to the fact that it is night or early morning, since you've experienced the condition night or early morning before. And then the last thing you remember is laying down on your bed and snuggling into the covers, turning towards your alarm clock, since the meaning of all this could be either that you missed your alarm or that it's still a short while off, and checking whether the stored process state that you are trying to come up with again, that you've experienced before, is worth amending or not. So that you have the state of no light, it's dark, it's night, you could have missed your alarm. All that kind of means a context. So in summary, processing information means receiving and understanding stimuli and categorizing said stimuli and connecting it with either preconceived criteria and emotions that you've had before, and deriving meaning from the results and saving those results for later use within your brain. And for each of these steps, some of us are better at them, some of us are worse, and hardly anyone is good at all of them. It also depends on the outside factors, such as what the environment is. So are you at home? Are you on a commute? Are you inside the office? Or maybe under the shower? And the distractions that are around you, like colleagues or music, noise, or social obligations, or complexity of the information you're trying to process, right? So how many pieces there are within the information that you're trying to process, and how they're connected to prior experiences or prior knowledge, and do they require further references, association, or investigation? And the higher, more frequent, or hard to digest some of these variables are usually, the harder it'll be for you to process, and for the average human as well. So worse, sometimes you and them, they will focus, they will require focus and concentration, or to even make the most out of what is touching you immediately. There are a few key factors which make it really difficult or easy, depending on the context, for us to process, connect, and derive meaning from information that's around us. And those three are noise, the filters, and last but not least, the complexity. So for noise, it usually means there's too much information available for the same ask, for the same criteria, for the same topic, and for us to make sense of continuously. And it's the feeling you have when you enter a specific problem, for example, to Google, and you end up on Stack Overflow, and there are at least 25 different comments with potential solutions. None of them is marked as an answer, and you kind of have the feeling that none of them really will find an actual answer for the problem you're trying to find. So, and the same can be said about our ambiguous documentation, or cookie banners, or your offices where people are cross-talking, playing music, and having video call without a meeting room. And it's closely connected to information overload, as it's all about too much information for the same purpose, whether relevant or irrelevant, hitting your perception at any moment in time, right? This is also why we have neural filters, which are keeping this noise, which this essentially is, at bay. And these filters, sorry, I think now my, just a moment.
Yeah, it's fine.
There we go. Now it should be back on screen. My screen just recovered, and now it's out again. I think I'm having a problem with the connector. I'm going to try to keep it online. I hope it works out, but for the time being, I hope you can still see the screen and everything's okay.
Yeah, we are still able to see the present.
Fantastic. So I was just talking about the filters that we all have, like neural filters that is keeping the noise that is all around us at bay, right? So because we as human beings are really good at filtering our surrounding information landscape, and without these filters, we would all be going mad. A lot of people that actually have neural deficiencies, or are otherwise, on the spectrum, they are actually lacking some of the filters, which is making their brains basically go haywire each and every time they're getting too much information. And we all, as human beings, have been taught from a very early age on that there's certain impulses and sensory events that are meaningless to us, as in that they aren't adding any immediate value, are basically being discarded. 80% of what we learn in our lives, we pick up until the ages of 18 to 20. So just reiterate this for yourself. 80% of what you've learned in your lifetime, you will have learned until the ages 18 to 20. And with the remaining capacity, the remaining 20%, struggling to keep up with what's constantly hitting its connected senses on a 24-hour basis and 7 days a week with information, tidbits, and other kind of fragments of information, right? And it is therefore absolutely necessary for us to filter our environment, right? And depending on our level of stress and prior knowledge and age and aptitude and sometimes even ignorance, it's a very subjective barrier. Some are forming with higher quality, like they are able to discern relevant information and are staying focused, or are irrelevant information that is discarded upon impact, and some are not. And for any system that's meant to encourage you to consume information, the signal to noise ratio is therefore an important factor and has a considerable impact on consumption added value in any industry. For example, a marketing ad would need to be able to really speak to you in order to sift through the filters that we already have set up. And last but not least, we were talking about complexity before really shortly, but now let's dive a little bit deeper, because complexity really is the worst offender in all of this, because it's hardly ever under our control when it comes to information that's consumed or correlated by us. So I usually am not at liberty to say I want to consume this particular information. It just hits me. I can't tell whether I can't tell it to not hit me, right? And most of the time, even just understanding that a problem is complex even adds further complexity on top of that, since you need to be aware that a problem actually is complex in order to take a step back and consider the available options. And that's why we're taking, let's take a closer look at complexity. I think that's probably better here. First off, a general quote about complexity, which although we aren't necessarily focused just on security today, pretty much applies to any field of modern software development and engineering. So complexity is the worst enemy of security. Secure systems should be cut to the bone and made as simple as possible. There's no substitute for simplicity. Unfortunately, simplicity goes against everything our digital future stands for. And this relates to what I mentioned earlier, right? And the general level of noise and distraction we're exposed to in our daily lives. And Bruce Schneier criticizes that this pretty much goes against our actual goal in designing systems that are simple and secure. And the same can be said when considering complexity in dashboards. As I briefly mentioned before, it's as hard to deal with complexity as it is realizing that the situation or event is complex, as witnessed by the failing simple solutions addressing complex problems usually, right? The silver bullets. The short path doesn't always lead to the most appropriate or even economically feasible solution. Instead, considering all the factors involved and connecting the elements involved to form an opinion or come to this discussion and course of action usually is required to solve a complex problem. Also, addressing complexity with simplicity might lead to other, sometimes even more serious issues, right? So different levels of complexity, since you're just making the problem worse, quote unquote, by not recognizing and respecting the level of complexity you're dealing with in the first place. And complexity is hard to address because a lot of components, obscure dependencies, and nonlinear resolution strategies, and information asymmetry, whereas you don't have all the pieces of a puzzle in front of you, aren't able to put them, or you aren't able to put them together in a meaningful way, right? So this is basically all the information that you have, you can't necessarily make sense of because it's a puzzle. It's not a picture. Subjective experience and knowledge also plays a huge part, I'd say. And what might be an easy task for some is an insurmountable challenge for the uninitiated or inexperienced. And even seasoned veterans sometimes aren't able to deduct the proper correlations from the complex data that is presented to them. Have you ever wondered who wrote that particular piece of code, whether there's the same person or not, and were you about to give them a stern talking to? And when discovering that it was actually you about 2 days ago or at 9 o'clock in the evening, yeah, that's pretty much what it feels like, right? That's I've been in a situation so many times, and this is basically what this feels like, right? Because the subjective experience when it comes to information or digesting information. Um, why is complexity though so important in all of this, right? Why are we talking about this so extensively, especially when it comes to information overload? Because we, as in us software developers or people working in the software industry, love cramming additional complexity into our work. And this is especially true for engineering dashboards. This is a real-world example of a dashboard presented on a 24-inch screen somewhere in the corner for a ThoughtWorks team. All the examples you're going to see in the next coming minutes are coming from fellow colleagues. Thank you so much, everyone who kindly lent me that trust, only to be dragged in front of a worldwide audience to be frowned upon. There are a few notable things here which I wanted to get into, and I apologize for the blurry picture in advance. Obviously, there's some client-sensitive material here that I can't present to everyone. First and foremost, what you see on the screen are lots of tiny numbers. There aren't just tiny in this picture. I've seen this actually on screen somewhere presented. For somebody clueless about the data to understand what's on there, you'd have to come really close to the screen. And even then, you'd need to know about the internal structure and how the dashboard is meant to present information to you, right? For some reason, there's also a world map in the corner, which all of 3 countries are highlighted red. And the percentage and deviations are also really small, anywhere from 1% to 3%, which is probably statistically insignificant, right? There's also statistics and numbers from at least a couple of services on there, each of them unseparated and unordered and red as a signal color, something that draws attention, like we're wired that way, red draws attention, is used to visualize pretty much everything and even uninteresting data. And all in all, this dashboard signal to noise ratio, if we're talking about previously, right, is exceptionally high. And the information presented isn't clearly ordered. It presents a lot of data that you probably are never going to even take a look at once, or even not once in a while. For example, if you take a look at the map and how are Alaska's numbers doing today, you probably won't notice that or won't care for it all that much, but every once in a while. And for a dashboard that's upon a screen in your team space, it'll probably fade out of your conscience easily and quickly, because you don't consider the information that's on it relevant to you or your daily routine, right? Now, a different example. This one's just a little better because it has clear indicators for states. So it has red for bad, it has green for okay, it has blue for working on it. And what's curious about this, though, is that what it actually is 2 different stacks of dashboards on a single screen. And while the one on the left side is using colored cues to direct attention, the one on the right side is presenting only numbers, which you either need to read a tiny text for or rather know what the context is beforehand. And what's also important is that while it's presenting numbers, 3 out of the 8 numbers are 0, so nothing. And essentially the same can be said about the green tiles on the left. Most of them are just saying, I'm okay. And one of them even says, GDPR is okay. Whether it is questionable, I guess, is at the eye of the beholder. In essence, there's a strong focus on this dashboard, but it's wasting space and attention span by presenting information that's unnecessary for people to get a grasp of what's currently going on. It also doesn't clearly indicate what numbers represent a state, and that's vital to recognize as wrong, which is important to the context people either need to just know or pick up while working with whatever apps this is monitoring, right? Correlations are also important since physically these 2 dashboards are separate and you wouldn't be able to represent a combined state. So whatever is represented on one side doesn't necessarily reflect the state on the other side. Overall, the noise is still fairly high, mainly due to its design, and the inclusion of okay states and the separate dashboard stacks and all that really doesn't, limit the noise at all. And it also has inherent complexity because it doesn't provide a lot of context for numbers. There's no indicator for what's good, for example. Moving on to another example, and this one is much more focused, right? And it's using clear indicators. There's a much clearer progression in the graphs it is using for representing numbers. It's also using two different dashboard stacks, but they're applying the same concept of indication. So colors, red means bad, blue, green means good. And it's making it easier for everyone to recognize what the current state actually is, be it good or bad, right? The complexity is still around since the graphs are begging to be understood at close range, right? So you still have to move closer to the dashboard to actually get what the indicators are for. And the relevance of all these numbers for somebody who's just trying to get a glimpse at what the current state is, for me at least, would be doubtful. The noise is still all around since you're representing good numbers with green indicators again. So there's a lot of things going on and snapping and whatever. And although it is green, it's still represented, right? Last but not least, I think if we're going for what good looks like, this would be from the examples that I have distilled from various colleagues. This would probably be one of them that I find the most appealing. This is a dashboard for delivery infrastructure, and it's the cleanest so far that we've seen since it only has a single context and a single purpose, and it's using clear indicators for state. The viewer immediately knows what it's for and what it displays. It's well designed, it's understandable, and it's even understandable from a distance. And the only criticism I would have here is, again, superfluous information presented by the color green and the 0 errors on prod in the last 15 minutes. It's basically positive reassurance that everything's okay. If you need that, that's fair, but generally I'd say you don't have to have it on a big screen TV then. There are no errors right now, but there could be later, and why would you give me that information on a big screen anyway if it's 0 right now? So what is this critique based on, right? So generally you would say, if you look at information theory, you could easily describe or summarize what all of these examples had in common. They're all falling into categories 1 through 6 when it comes to reducing information overload and helping people make better decisions based upon the data that's presented to them. In engineering, this could potentially mean thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in time wasted, and customers unhappy, and management being fired on the way out. And the sooner you're able to isolate the issues and gather all the puzzle pieces to make an informed decision, the better, because it provides more value with more immediate effect. So let's go through these categories with a few examples, right? So the first one is your classic spam, or people trying to sell you stuff on the street. There's information, but neither do you want it, nor is it relevant to you. You'd be surprised how many dashboards actually fall into this category. The second one is people thinking they may need certain bits of information, and it's also available to them, but it's actually irrelevant to their decision-making process or task at hand. Most dashboards end up with a lot of data on them just because a single individual thought it might be useful or has seen other dashboards like this before, while the information just ends up impacting the signal-to-noise ratio in a negative way, and it adds to the overall complexity of the data presented on the dashboard. The third one is the slight twist on the second category, as the information you think is necessary isn't even available, and making you send people on a goose chase for nothing since the data you've caught is irrelevant. Most people run into this even when creating dashboards in the first place. Instead of taking the data that's already available and visualizing it, they're thinking of anything that might provide additional insight, and they're creating data aggregators first before even thinking about their dashboard design. And with any agile project, I'd advise you to start small. As with any agile project, I'd advise you to start small, especially when it comes to your dashboards. So, because the fourth case is exactly what you're going to find yourself in, if you're approaching your dashboards in an agile way. You have relevant information on a dashboard, but you're missing certain bits and pieces, and you'll have to make it available in order to create value with your dashboards. Most dashboards are hitting the ceiling at some point in time, so you'll be affected by this sooner or later. The fifth one is a typical case of unknown unknowns, where you didn't even consider information to be valuable to you, and therefore it's also not available on your dashboard. And it also takes some time to analyze an analysis to realize that you might need some additional information to complete your task or visualize it on a dashboard. The sixth point is a variation of this, with the exception that the information you will want to see eventually is actually available already. You just didn't think to put it up on a dashboard already. Luckily, and contrary to the other category, there's also an easy remedy for this case, which is just putting up the information on your dashboard. Last but not least, if we're thinking about the seventh category is where you want your dashboard to live in, the intersection. This means your dashboard is relevant, focused, simple, easy to understand, and provides only relevant information to the audience at any given moment in time. It takes a while to get to this place, as you've seen going through the different paces, as you've seen before, right? And you will struggle sometimes to get the right balance, right? But ideally, your dashboard looks something like this. So I know I've had trouble with the presentation before, but this isn't an error. The screen isn't broken, and the presentation is still working, because this is actually a blank field. There's absolutely zero data presented on this dashboard, because everything is fine. Everything is in an okay state. The signal to noise ratio on this and the complexity are as low as it gets. Nobody would be looking at this dashboard at the moment because it doesn't add any value, which is good. Because as I said, everything's fine, right? This is the dashboard's okay state. Now, whenever an issue is detected, you'll see relevant information popping up on an empty canvas. In this case, 1 out of 4 health checks that are being monitored by the dashboard are failing right now. You can also see a lot of useful context in, for example, when the run for the check was done 5 minutes ago, which environment you're looking at, which in this case is called prod, which service is impacted, adaptably called my service, and along, you could also present potentially relevant contextual information, right? Like a graph which shows abnormalities and shows up additional information whenever certain criteria are met about other metrics and when they're fulfilled, right? All of this, from an information theory perspective, would catch your eye almost immediately. And it would also tell an uninitiated member of the team what's happening and that there's a problem, right? Solving a problem might be harder still, but that's also not the purpose of this dashboard. It's here to allow people to realize there is a problem with as much information necessary and relevant to tackle the issue heads on, right? Your filters will be working in your favor with this dashboard, since whenever an issue is resolved, the tiles just disappear. It's a fairly simple logic. If something needs attention, then display red tiles, else stay blank. You could also think about indicators for in-progress tasks or processes, just so that you know something is being worked on. Just make sure to give the color coding, which is simple enough to understand. It doesn't conflict with your usual humanly trained expectations, right? For example, you could give it an orange or blue hue. Those are frequently used as they're representing states between yellow, red, or green and violet. A fantastic example, if you're looking for something that you could use today, is a software called Nevergreen. And you can, if you type Nevergreen into Google or GitHub, you'll find it almost immediately. It's a dashboard that can be used for pretty much any of the existing vendors like Travis or CircleCI, for Jenkins, also for GoCD. There are a lot of different adapters you can use, and it follows exactly this particular pattern. It only displays tiles when there's something going on or something wrong. So it'll basically visualize your pipelines in a meaningful way only if there's something going on that needs your attention. So all in all, at the end, to summarize, take your dashboards more seriously when it comes to designing for human beings, and create meaningful insights, and don't just vomit data onto a screen, since that won't provide any additional value for you, on your team, for nobody. We as human beings are really good at filtering out distractions, and this is especially true for visual cues. Sight is our strongest sense. That's why ads on the internet still are a thing, right? And why people are having auto-playing videos now, because we're already so desensitized to visual cues. We have to also bring in another. Sense, which is, auditory or visual stimuli. So whenever you're returning to wherever your dashboard is, and when you're taking another look at your dashboards, right? Take a look at them again and ask yourself, is this simple enough for anyone to understand? If it isn't, why isn't it? Would it be worthwhile to strip it from certain information to reduce its noise and complexity? And maybe add visual cues or colors or remove them? Is all the information on it truly relevant for what you're using the dashboard for? Do you have maybe like 15 graphs on it you can barely read or mount for a dashboard that's mounted on a wall at all times? And maybe this is finally a good application for machine learning or artificial intelligence, right? Recognize the data points that are actually relevant to make your data more relevant because before it hits your dashboard. And reducing the number of data points might also aid this particular criteria, right? Just turning down the complexity. Ask yourself, how are you dealing with contextual information? Do you have to draw correlations on your own? How are you visually and logically connecting state and data points? Could you improve this, for example, through grouping or different forms of representation? It should probably not be a world map as we saw in the beginning, right? Or do you have any other measures of grouping relevant information, right? Are you only displaying information when it's truly relevant for the context? Or are you displaying it alongside maybe other potential vital data, right? Make sure that it fits the particular contextual criteria that you're trying to solve. And is the information you're presenting specific enough, right? Are all the data points necessary to make an informed decision about your time? How high is the noise on your dashboard in general? Can you strip away certain representations or simplify visual elements to make it less noisy, but still retain the value and make it and still keep it relevant? Also, by the way, don't show states that you would consider inactionable, right? Like everything's okay. They only add overall noise. And on top of that, is everyone within your team also able to clearly see and understand what's on your dashboard? Do you know who your audience is, right? What are their needs? What are their requirements? Have you ever talked to folks that are designing important interactive elements within your organization? Because it could help you, right? If you're working with people that are working in user design or are working in UX, they have a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience when it comes to designing for human beings. And if you're thinking about your dashboards, just talk to them for once and just see whether you can make your dashboard more accessible given your audience or the other team members that are involved with it. And lastly, keep your dashboards as stateless as you can. Your dashboard shouldn't aggregate information. It should present it, right? In a concise and easy to understand way. And if your dashboard isn't just presenting data, but also fetching or mangling or storing or providing it to others who might hit performance issues sooner or later, that's just not something that you should do, honestly. The barrier between you and your data lets you be more mindful of what data you make available to your dashboard and what data might not be needed, right? So if you all don't throw it into one basket, you won't have the problem of sorting it out. Be mindful about what data you're querying from your overall system. In conclusion, overall, all of these things will lead you to creating more meaningful dashboards, which can add great value for you and your team, and in the end, also your audience for your dashboard, right? And that should generally be, for me at least, the intended purpose of any dashboard. They shouldn't be a burden to keep up with, but they're supposed to be added value, and they're supposed to be a pleasure to take in. Otherwise, dashboards are bound to be ignored, misunderstood, or worse, discarded completely. And with that, I'm at the end of my talk, and thank you very much for listening.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Moritz. So folks, if you have any other questions you would like to ask the speaker, please go to the slides.app Google app, and you should be able to ask questions to the speaker now. Yeah.
All right, I have a first question here, which is this one. So, aren't dashboards also supposed to be a proactive way to look at what might go wrong? I think you're right. I think visualizing data in general can lead you to discover issues that you weren't anticipating before. I think they're not necessarily what I was talking about. So because usually these dashboards are things that you take a look at on your computer screen, and or are perusing in dedicated time. So you have time to actually take a look at the data and the complexity that is presented by the dashboard you're trying to look at. Where usually when you're taking a look at a dashboard that's presented within an environment, like on a wall side or on a table, all these graphs are just going to be confusing over time, and it's very unlikely for you, according to information theory, to really discern that there is an issue that you could appropriately identify from looking at the graphs intermittently. And it'll actually be detrimental to your overall perception of the particular dashboard you're trying to look at, because in the end, they'll just blend into the rest of the environment. The noise will just be too high. So yes, I would absolutely agree. There can be dashboards which you can take a look at to discern whether or not there are values that are important or are signifying certain issues within your stack. The difference here, the major difference really, is that you're proactively focusing on those dashboards usually, and are not taking them as a background a noise, or not seeing them as something that is just there without any specific purpose, right? I think that's for me, that's the major difference. It's also, though, important to realize that we've been talking about applications of things like artificial intelligence and machine learning for a long time now. And I think one of the most important parts really is that continuous data is something that is actually quite predictable after a while. So, and if there are certain things that don't seem predictable, you can have automated processes which take a look at them and say, okay, this seems to be out of what I usually was trying to find. And there are already services out there which do this, which lets, like, New Relic has such a service, for example. So generally, that will be the answer to this particular question. Would be that yes, you're focusing on these usually, and they're a thing, but also maybe it's time to take a look at alternatives which are already doing this work for you, instead of trying to come up with a dashboard that's kind of trying to hog your senses. Next question. Could you suggest any kind of framework or rules for building user dashboards, EA and non-engineering dashboards? Yes, of course. I was a huge fan of Dashing before, which is a Ruby framework for building dashboards, because to me, as a former Ruby developer, it came to me fairly easy, and it was very easy DSL. I think it was called something else in between. Now it's called Dashing again, but I think if you're looking at a Google or GitHub and you're typing in Dashing, you'll probably find something which is appropriate. Otherwise, there are other frameworks out there which I personally haven't worked with extensively, so I usually don't recommend anything I haven't tried myself. But you can definitely take a look at ThoughtWorks Tech Radar if you're interested, because I know for a fact there are some other frameworks out there which have been on the radar before. So if you're typing dashboard into the Tech Radar, there should be like at least one or two different frameworks that are showing up, and you'll get some context. I think that would be my answer to that question. Any other questions in the meantime? So unfortunately, I can't see the chat right now. If there are any questions. Oh, there was just another question coming in. Say, just a second. I hope this actually fits on the screen. As you mentioned, if I group certain graphs or tiles together, say on a time series, it can give me strong indications of an impending problem. For example, I can have my latency and connection pool size grouped together. The rise in one in correlation to the other can signify an issue. Yes, absolutely. As I said before, correlation is king, and if you group those two together, it'll definitely be apparent. Then again, as I said before, right, I'm not sure whether this is something that you need to do manually on a dashboard these days. I think if you're aware that these two go together and certain indicators are, and you have a baseline, right? So I'm saying if you're starting a new service and it doesn't have a baseline, then obviously there has to be some manual intervention involved in all of this to make sure that you're actually tracking the right data, you're monitoring the right things. But if you have a baseline, let's say of a month of operations, and you take a look at the data and you're correlating data points, then it'll be, I wouldn't call it easy, right? It's still not, it's non-trivial, but at least it's solvable or probable to come up with a way of automating this. And I still think it's better for you to have a dashboard that's publicly displayed that doesn't contain a lot of noise than as if you were trying to come up with a way of displaying it publicly and then coming up with these correlations. That's my opinion, obviously, after the talk that I've just given, right? Given the experience that I have. But I could totally see that people are might be thinking differently on this. All right, I don't see any other questions coming in right now. So generally, if you see it on the slide right here, feel free to write me an email if you have other questions. Oh, there's another question coming in. People are typing still. I'm sorry, I'm being too fast. The question is, can you give a few examples of stateless? Yes, of course. So generally, what I would consider stateless is really the fact that your dashboard doesn't draw any conclusions from prior data. So the information that's being taken in is either already pre-processed or is a clear indicator on its own. Whereas if your dashboard has to process a time series and make correlations on its own, this is what I would consider running from state. So stateless would be, for example, number of open issues on the GitHub repository. This dashboard will never store any state. It'll always query the API and it'll get the latest number of issues. That's what I would consider stateless. Or you can process the time series on a continuous basis, but never store the results, but just draw your conclusions from the results of the time series. I think if you're doing it like this, then that's what I would consider stateless. Again, stateful, which would mean the dashboard has a data store of its own and ingests data and is then running certain operations on the data in order to display it or to discern certain information tidbits from it. That would be my conclusion. All right, the next one. How would you describe then alerting versus dashboards? That's an excellent question. Thank you so much. So I think alerting in general goes much, much deeper than just displaying relevant information, because I think dashboards are visual indicators, right? And if you as a human being are meant to be alerted by something, then it can also be something which cannot be visualized, or it could be something that is triggered after a while. Whereas dashboards are meant to give you an aid for processing certain criteria or certain states that are not normal. So let's say, this is also why I opted, by the way, to really emphasize the fact that I don't think displaying okay or green on a dashboard is necessarily feasible. So I think if you're considering alerting is a much, much deeper subject, and it's much broader subject as well, because you can alert in so many different things, and you can structure your alerts in so many different ways, and the escalation chains can be different, and the way the services are doing alerting can be different. Whereas dashboards are really focusing on who is meant to consume this information, what helpful information can be displayed, and what's the context in all of this? Do I need to do any correlations with other data? So essentially, it's meant to give you, like to do in the movies, all these helpful things pop up all of a sudden, and they give the hero in charge, they give them the right context to make the right decisions. That's what dashboards are for. And alerting is much more about making sure that the state that is not okay is recognized as something which is important and is then escalated throughout certain processes or even automated chains that are triggering a response. So alerting could, for example, mean that the issue is resolved automatically, whereas on a dashboard, usually what you would have is an error which cannot be resolved automatically or is even triggered by an action or inaction of a human being. I think that's what I would generally answer that question. Another question. I would imagine my dashboards could be a window to make my alerting better over a course of time. Your thoughts? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think with dashboards, it's with anything. You start at some point and you end up at another. And throughout the paces, you are progressing slowly or fast. And ideally, you end up with a dashboard that's the most valuable in the end. And the most valuable means that it really just displays the information that you have found over the course of your exercise, or the course of development, found really important and helpful. Um, and as such, all the information that's no longer on the dashboard is still probably important, but it's probably intertwined with the way that you're doing alerting now, because you've realized, okay, if thing A happens, it means we have to escalate, but it doesn't have to be on a dashboard anymore because we have an automated way of doing alerting now. And it's also not as important as we thought it to be. You could still have it on a dashboard, but alerting is basically definitely something that you can string up with whatever information you'd had before and make sure that that's relevant. So yeah, I would agree. Alerting alerting can definitely be improved by taking whatever you put on your dashboard and making sure the relevant information is to be consumed or has been consumed by the appropriate people that are looking at the dashboard.
Quick time check. We have 3 more minutes for the questionnaire.
Right. Right now, I don't see any other questions coming in, or is there one? Oh yeah, there it is. Sorry, I have to scroll each and every time, and sometimes the scroll doesn't actually show up. So how do you pitch it to management who would think dashboards are a collection of important charts or graphs? That's a very important question, right? So I highlighted, I think at the beginning, I highlighted the different ways the dashboards are designed and the audiences that you're addressing with these dashboards. And as such, I think it's incredibly important to make people realize that one dashboard does not mean one size fits all. So whatever management is used to in terms of dashboarding doesn't mean it provides the same value to an engineering team. And you have to make people realize that's the case. So that would be my answer to this, rough answer to this question, right? So the way that you're pitching it is much more you can have a dashboard which displays important graphs and charts, but it would be a dashboard which people can consume on a voluntary basis, and it's not displayed on a screen somewhere within your area, or it's not relevant for engineering on a daily basis. In fact, I would argue in favor of so-called KPI dashboards for every team or department, because it makes this information much more visible, and you can hold people much better accountable towards their goals. And it also eases the burden on each and every one of aggregating this information. Whereas if you were sitting in a team and each and every time your management folks would pop in and would say, hey, can you tell me what our sales numbers were for this and that, or how many outages did we have in the last quarter, and whereas you could have a dashboard with these numbers on that management could go to, which is automatically curated, and they could answer these questions for themselves, right? So I'd say make sure that people understand that there are different audiences for different types of dashboards, and make sure that you make the most out of whatever dashboard you're trying to come up with, that you're trying to design. Because otherwise, people fall into this fallacy or this trap of designing one dashboard, which is supposed to fit too many different use cases, and it's not usable or valuable for anyone. It's really just, another offense in all this I saw a lot of times at customers, by the way, is the case of rotating dashboards, where you don't just have a single dashboard, but you actually have like 5 different dashboards which are rotating on a time basis, where like every 10 seconds there's a new dashboard popping up. Nobody will ever consume that. Nobody will ever seriously take a look at this. It doesn't even make sense. It's wasted space. So that would be my answer to this question, really, is to make sure that you know the audience, and make people realize that there are different dashboards for different purposes.